This is another iRaw podcast. We podcast to make the world a better place for animals.
Dr. Jeroen O'Sullivan does like knowing animals. Dr. Jeroen O'Sullivan does like knowing animals.
Hey people, welcome to Knowing Animals. My name's Jeroen O'Sullivan and I do like knowing animals. This episode of Knowing Animals is from our Protecting Animals series, where we speak to animal advocates, past and present, about the work they do for animals. But before I get to that, I need to tell you share a little message from our sponsors. So this episode of Knowing Animals is brought to you by ASA. ASA is the Australasian Animal Studies Association. ASA is a really, really wonderful organisation. One of the things ASA does is send out a regular newsletter to its members. The last newsletter landed in my inbox just a few weeks ago, and it was jam-packed with news about upcoming conferences, calls for papers, recent publications, member profiles. It's really, really a great read. So if you're not receiving the ASA newsletter, that's because you're not a member. And ASA does need members. So please think about joining ASA, the Australasian Animal Studies Association, and then you'll be able to receive their member newsletter just like I do. Now this episode is also brought to you by the wonderful people at Animal Publics. I was actually just at the University of Sydney Press's website a few moments ago before I started recording, eagerly looking up readings for the upcoming teaching year in Australia. There is so much going on at Sydney University Press, but in particular their Animal Public series is specifically dedicated to animal studies topics. The books are curated to be about a whole range of issues that will be of great interest to animal studies scholars. It's a real go-to place. There's literature, there's historical texts, there's political studies, there's all kinds of different analysis, and they're bringing out books all the time. In fact, I already have an idea of the books that they're going to be bringing out this year, and I can tell you it's really exciting. So think about checking out Animal Publics, a great place to find upcoming animal studies scholarship. Okay, let's get down to business. So it is a mild day here in Sydney town, but quite nice and sunny. And we're here in the home of the Knowing Animals podcast, which is my lounge room in Annandale in Sydney. And I'm very lucky to be joined by a very special guest. Now, as listeners know, my ability to pronounce names is atrocious, but I think even the best among us would be a little bit stumped by the name of my guest this week. So by agreement, I'm going to ask him to introduce himself. So this week we're joined by
Jeroen van Kernebeek,
who has told me that I can call him Jay. And Jay is director of Four Paws in Australia. And today we're going to have a chat to Jay about his work for animals and about Four Paws and about a whole range of animal issues in Australia. So welcome to the podcast, Jay.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here.
And thank you for getting me out of a spot of bother with your name.
No worries. You're not the only one struggling over it.
So can you start by telling us why you got involved in animal protection?
Yeah, that's actually a really good question. And I've been thinking about it a little bit because there wasn't really a really specific thing that came to mind. It was sort of a gradual process for me, I think, during my teen years. And I think one of the main things that happened was that, I grew up in a very ordinary family in the sense of how we were dealing with animals, which was, we had respect for them and we said we loved them, but at the same time, we would eat certain species of them as well. But my parents were also a member of like the RSPCA in the Netherlands, where I'm from WWF and Greenpeace. And I started to read a lot of those magazines in my early teens and really started to, see how many things we are doing as a human species, which are not only, in my opinion, in those days already were really bad, but also very self-destructive, really, to ourselves, the world around us, but also to our souls, I think. So starting reading those magazines for me really was an eye-opener, and I started really thinking about the principle of fairness, and that's been sort of a guiding thing for me throughout my career. Where as most of your listeners will agree, I'm sure, what we're doing to animals is completely unfair, and it's completely irrational. It's completely unjustifiable, and for me, that gave me really a very strong drive to try to do something about that, because I just felt I couldn't just stand by and let that happen. That's really how it all started for me.
And so perhaps you could tell us a little bit about how you found yourself in Australia and how you began the process of getting involved in animal protection here in Australia. I think at least some of our listeners perhaps would love to think that they could have a career as a professional in the animal protection space. So it's always interesting to hear a little bit about how one moves into that kind of career.
Yeah, definitely. And, as you know, it's a very small movement, so there's not a lot of opportunities for paid work. So I feel very, very lucky that I've been able to, take that opportunity. And for me, it started in the Netherlands, where I started working as a volunteer at the local RSPCA whilst I was in uni. And actually the first thing that they sort of asked me to do was that there was a lovely team, and they were in a dilapidated building. And one of the problem was they had plants growing up their roofs, and they basically create leakage and things like that. So the first thing they asked me to do was to remove all of that growth. And basically that meant destroying a habitat for little creatures like spiders and bugs and whatever. And whilst I was doing that, I was like, oh, hang on, this is not really why I contacted you guys and I wanted to help you with. So I started doing some local campaigns for them pretty quickly. I got involved with the issue of the use of wild animals in circuses, and with that, I created a bit of a niche for myself in Holland, because no one was really tackling that, the root cause of it, and trying to get that outlawed. So that's how it started for me. I just applied for a training course to become a biology teacher. Whilst during that same week, a few days later, I got 2 job offers. One for the work that I did with the circuses, and the other one from the Dutch Jane Goodall Institute. So that meant for me that I went with the money in that instance, because obviously everyone needs that as well. And I left the studies to what it was. Really it was something that came about from starting as a volunteer in a movement. I had no training that was really of any use. I studied human movement sciences, which is in the medical field. It's really the volunteer work that sort of put me a little bit, so to say, in the spotlight. And some people noticed me and gave me an opportunity and a chance to prove myself.
Wonderful. I think probably starting off as a volunteer is the pathway for most people.
Yes.
So let's turn our attention now to Four Paws. I have to admit, it's not an organisation that I feel super familiar with, so I'm really fascinated. Can you tell us a little bit about how the organisation started?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, Four Paws, it's still very new in Australia, and that's why a lot of people won't be very familiar with it. It originated 31 years ago in Austria, in Europe, founded by a person who was really passionate campaigner against the use of fur in our fashion. And that person, Heli Dungler, very sadly just passed away early in January this year, completely unexpected. But over the past 31 years, he has built one of the biggest animal protection charities globally, with many projects on all the continents. And so a lot of the work that we do is we rescue animals from a lot of desperate situations, and that is mostly bears and lions and tigers that we rescue from zoos, from circuses, but also from war zones. We go into places like Iraq, and we currently have a team in Sudan where we are trying to help animals that are basically hanging by a thread in their enclosures in zoos. They're not getting fed anymore, and we try to rescue them and bring them to one of our sanctuaries throughout the world, or to a partner who can take care of them and where they can start a new life. But a lot of other work that we do is also in relation to companion animals. So we do a lot of stray animal care projects in Southeast Asia. We work on a dog and cat meat campaign to end that trade in Southeast Asian countries. We do also a lot of lobby work. We do a lot of work on farm animals, mainly in Europe, where of course we still have our biggest footprint, so to say. It's really grown into one of the dominant voices globally on animal protection. And it's wonderful to have been able to build up the organization here in Australia over the last 4 to 5 years. And we really look forward to becoming better known here in Australia and finding a lot of supporters for the good causes that we fight for.
I saw online that your founder died, and what I observed was that there are a lot of outpourings of love and sorrow and shock. And I must admit that was really the first time the organisation really came onto my radar. But it seemed to be a lot of people in the UK were responding very passionately. So obviously that was a blow, and he was deeply loved.
He certainly was. He was a wonderful leader. He was a very compassionate person, not only to animals, but also to his staff and to people in general. I must say I've always really appreciated his guidance throughout the last years, and the way with the vision that he had to build this organization. Certainly for me, it's been an important person in the last couple of years in my life as well, and he will be dearly missed.
So I hope that there aren't too many bears and lions and tigers in needing of rescue in Australia, although I imagine there are some. Can you tell us about what your focus is here in Australia?
Yeah, absolutely. No, luckily, we don't have too many bears in captivity here. We do actually have quite a few lions and tigers in zoos, and there's, I think, 2 circuses left as well that still perform with them. Coming from the Netherlands, where in general animal welfare standards and legislation is a little bit stricter than here in Australia, I was actually quite shocked to see the things that you can do with these animals in some of the zoos here. They offer all kinds of hand-on experiences. You can feed the lions and you can have a walk with the tiger, and I've never seen anything like that in the Netherlands. So that was a bit of a surprise. So I think there's certainly work for us to do in that respect. But what we are focusing on with our campaigns at the moment is a campaign that we launched last year, which is called Wear It Kind. It's a campaign to build an ethical fashion movement and to really make animal welfare the third pillar of that movement that we've seen quite broadly of trying to make the fashion industry more responsible for how they work. So there's a lot of focus on how the people are treated that are producing our clothes in awful conditions in low-wage countries. Then there's a lot of talk about the environmental impact of fashion, a lot of the plastics that is used to create clothing nowadays. The fast fashion movement, where we buy things and we throw them away very quickly again, creates a huge environmental burden. But one aspect that has had some attention but has not got the same kind of coverage is how animals are treated in the fashion industry. And we're all very well aware of the campaigns that have been going on for decades against the use of fur, But we still see it in our society, even in a country where fur is certainly not necessary because of the climate, not that it is anywhere, because there's perfect non-human alternatives for it that can keep us warm in any condition. But we still see it here as a fashion item. And we of course have the issue of mulesing of sheep here in Australia, which is a specific Australian topic, where part of the behinds of the wool sheep are basically literally cut away without any anesthesia to prevent another welfare problem. Those are issues that we really want to tackle. And we think we'll do that with building a movement where people really start to understand that this is an issue that we all have responsibility for, and it is something that the industry is deliberately making as invisible as possible. So we want to make it very visible, and we want to hold the companies accountable, and we want to really make sure that transparency is improved. And we had some really good successes since we launched, because a couple of very big names in Australia, Country Road Group, for example, but also Target and in Kmart, announced towards the end of last year that they would phase out the use of mulesing in their products, and that they would create stronger animal welfare policies. So that's one of the very big focuses of us on a long-term basis. And of course now, the whole animal welfare movement, I think almost, is very much focused on the bushfire disaster and the impact that it has on animals. And I think one of the really sort of hopeful things of this is that we've seen so many disasters where animals were hardly mentioned, but that's really different this time, I think. Maybe, I don't know if you agree on that, but we have seen so many stories in the news about the impact, particularly on our wildlife. 1 billion plus animals that have perished in the fires, and many more probably to go because there's no food and no water for them. We really want to make sure that we do everything we can to help that wildlife, what is left, to survive, and to make sure that the recovery is as good and as quick as possible, and that we also don't lose all those species that are now really hanging by a thread.
And so, thinking of the bushfires, can you give listeners an example of some of the things you're actually doing, some of the on the ground or applied things you're doing?
Yeah, so the main thing that we've been able to do so far is trying to support those groups in the best possible position to give the quickest help to animals possible, because we are not set up to be wildlife carers, or we don't have the facilities for that either, or the expertise. So we've really been supporting a lot of the groups on the ground with finances. And also we are currently working very closely with a small rescue group in the Southern Highlands called Dimmock's Wildlife Retreat. And they are a wonderful husband and wife team who are looking after a lot of animals, a lot of wildlife that get injured, not just by the bushfires, but also other causes like a lot of road accidents and things, obviously. So we're looking at building a long-term response to this need, which will not, just go away when the fires stop, but it will be a very long-term need to make sure the country recovers from this. We all know that Australia is very prone to natural disasters. So sadly, for sure, these things will reoccur in future. We want to make sure that we as an organization are in a good position to respond to that quickly, but also the movement more broadly, and that we learn our lessons from this horrible season that's still going on, sadly.
And so, can you tell us a little bit about what your size at the moment, where you're located, and also perhaps what you hope to see, what you hope to grow into, say, in the next 10 years?
Yeah, you're talking about in Australia, or So in Australia, we have an office here in Sydney with a small team of 7 people at the moment, so we started between 4 and 5 years ago, and we're trying to build it slowly and make sure that we build very strong and good connections with our supporters. We have a wonderful supporter base already now who are obviously very passionate about some of the projects that we do, the rescues that we do all over the world, the stray animal care work, but also the projects that we do here in Australia are resonating really well with our supporters. And we really hope that over the next 5 to 10 years, I will not be sitting with an interviewer anymore who haven't really heard about Four Paws, because we will be a known organization here for the good work that we do. So yeah, that's what I'm focusing on here.
I'm sorry I don't know more about you, but I'm learning.
That's
all good.
I can
learn.
I wasn't trying to put you on the spot.
So, Jay, I ask everyone who comes on the podcast to answer 5 quick questions. Are you ready for your 5 quick questions?
I am. Bring them on.
Okay. Can you recall when you first started to think that there was something wrong or problematic about the relationship between humans and animals?
Yeah, definitely. And I think we touched on it before when I mentioned that I started reading those magazines when I was a teenager at my parents' place. But actually, maybe an interesting thing to tell is that I think there was probably a few years before this happened, and I got this realization that there's something wrong with how we treat animals. Is that as I said, I grew up in a very normal family in how we treated animals. But one thing that we did, my parents, they would every year buy a calf together with another family that would be slaughtered in our local slaughterhouse. And my mom would go to the slaughterhouse to help process that meat and package it so it could go into the freezer. And I used to go with her as an early teenage boy. And for me, actually, it was a really interesting and exciting day out. I'm a bit shocked to say that now, but I didn't feel any negative emotions in those years. And I saw it all. I saw all the cruelty happening. I saw it from the animals being trucked in and then being stunned or shot in the head, and being bled out and cut to pieces, everything. But I didn't feel any negative emotions. I did not process what that would mean for the animal. So it was a couple of years later when I started reading these magazines that I started to reflect on that as well, and I really started to realize that there's something very weird with how we treat animals, and certainly because we said we loved animals, and we were always caring for dogs and cats and whatever that was around, but then at the same time we would be eating that meat, and we would not think twice about how the animal would have been treated to produce that product for us. So yeah, that's sort of how things evolved during my teenage years, and I think from there it really sort of started to evolve for me that I felt a real urge to do something about that and start to try to open people's eyes basically to how strange that our relationship was with animals.
Well, that brings me to the second quick question. Can you recall the first thing you did to try and bring about change?
Yeah, I can actually. One of the absolute first things that I can remember was that I wrote letters to the South Korean government to end eating of dog and cat meat. I mean, that was internationally quite a big campaign, and I think that was around the time of the Olympic Games in Seoul. So yeah, I wrote a lot of protest letters in my early days, and they went all over the world to try to influence policy. And now I sort of know how futile that effort would have been, knowing how much work goes into even create the smallest legislative change for animals. But that was one of the first things I did. And what about you, actually, Siobhan?
Oh, the first thing I did. Well, I think probably for me, one of the first. I get people answer in a range of different ways and conceptualize it in a range of different ways. But in my case, I was vegetarian from a young age and then vegan. So that's, of course, very good for animals. But I was living in Newcastle in New South Wales, so 2 hours north of Sydney. And I was, vegan and new to the city. And I went to a vegan cooking class. I just wanted to get out and about and meet people, do things, engage in the community. So I saw an ad for a vegan cooking class, which I attended. And the person who was running the cooking class was quite involved in Animal Liberation New South Wales. And because one of the other people who was very involved happened to live in Newcastle, they had monthly meetings in Newcastle. And so she said, you should come to the monthly meeting. And again, I was new to the city. I didn't have many contacts. And why not on a Saturday go to an animal liberation meeting? So that was the first thing I did, really, go to a meeting.
Yeah. And I guess in those days, and I'm not trying to say anything about how long ago that would have been, but that would have been a very small community, I assume, in a place like Newcastle, who were really into that veganism thing.
Yeah, it was certainly. Newcastle is a fairly progressive city. It's a small population, but it's a relatively progressive city in some regards. It's, a university city, and it's got artists live there, that kind of thing. So there is a little bit of a progressive kind of subculture.
Okay, yeah. That's good. Yeah. Look, I'm really only saying that because I was thinking about what Australia was in this respect when I moved here 11 years ago, in comparison to what I was used to in the Netherlands. And I think we've seen so much change in the last 10 years, which is really encouraging. When I came here, I was thinking like, wow, it's quite backward in a sense, and particularly if you would compare the level of legislation on how animals are protected. But over the last 10 years, we've seen such a huge uptake here of vegetarianism and veganism. And one of the really encouraging things, I think, is that I'm seeing is that even though our legislation is still relatively poor, you see the community really waking up to these issues. And you see a lot of people being more and more willing to put their money where their mouth is. And I think that's really an encouraging sign for the opportunities that we'll have in the future to make some good progress.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting that you say that, and I think it's good for listeners to hear that as well, because there, of course, is this rhetoric that comes from the government that Australia is a leader in animal welfare, and that's one of the justifications given for live animal exports. We've got to be exporting them because we're world leaders. Well, it's untrue. Now, you could hold our animal welfare legislation up to many other countries, particularly in the global south, and it would look quite progressive. But comparing it to the to European countries, no, it's not. It's not progressive at all. That said, I went to the vegan junk food bar in Amsterdam last year or the year before. It was great, but Melbourne's got a great vegan scene as well. So we're good on the cultural, I think.
Yeah, agreed.
But we cannot get our laws. There's structural impediments to progressive legal and political change in this country, and it affects animals, environment, a whole host of things.
Yes.
But Jay, you are sidetracking our 5 quick questions. They're getting less quick.
Well, was I? I was trying to turn the tables, was I? Yeah. So how long have you been doing this podcast? Have you ever talked about yourself?
This is a guerrilla effort. I have actually been interviewed, but not for the Protecting Animals series. So it's quite interesting.
All right.
So let's get back to it. We've got question number 3.
Yes, attention back on me, please.
Back on you. If you had to name one animal advocate who's had a big impact on you, who would it be?
The first person I would mention here again is the founder of Four Paws, Heli Dongler, who we spoke about earlier, and really the way he approached his work and how he has created such a important organization to further the cause of animals has really made a really big impact on me over the last years. But if you would allow me, and that's for the purpose of what I think your next question is going to be, I would like to acknowledge a few more people, so to say, because there's a lot of people who have played a very important role in getting me to where I am, and the work that enabling to do for me to do the work that I've done, and they all deserve some credit, but I won't name them by name because that's not the purpose of this exercise. But there's the people that gave me an opportunity with the RSPCA in the Netherlands to start volunteering. Then I got noticed by one of the biggest sanctuaries for exotic mammals in Europe, who offered me a job to start working on this campaign against the use of exotic animals in circus, because they had to mop up all the mess afterwards, and we're talking about chimpanzees and baboons and all kinds of other exotic animals that were used in circuses that basically came to them as a wreck, and they have to try to get them back to a normal sort of life. And there's so many more people. There's the people that gave me an opportunity, despite the fact that I was not a native speaker and I had very little cultural awareness about Australia when I moved here. But it gave me an opportunity to prove myself. Those were the people of Animals Australia. And then after that, I've been working with groups like Great UK USA, who are campaigning very hard all around the world to end the horrible greyhound racing industry. And at the moment, on a day-to-day basis, I'm really inspired by the wonderful team that I have, because they are all wonderful individuals that bring their passion and their energy to work every day, wanting to make this world a better place for animals. And it's really keeping my energy levels up as well. There's so many people that deserve acknowledgement and that have played a big role in my life. I think I'm not the only one that has that kind of life story, of course, but I think it's important to realize that it's not one person or a few. There's so many people around us that shape our paths. Any one of them could have not been there, and your whole, you would have been sidetracked, and you would have ended up somewhere very different.
Wonderful. So what is the most important thing animal advocates can do for animals?
Yeah, and I was expecting that question, and that's why I wanted to say what I said before, because I think the most important thing that we can do is to sort of celebrate the diversity that we have in our movement, because all those people that I refer to are working in very different ways. They all have different visions. They all have different methodologies. They all are in different stages of their own journey of how they treat animals. But one thing that I know they all have in common is they would never publicly criticize other people that are trying to make this world a better place for animals. And I think that's one of the main things that is distracting us from our mission, is a lot of the, a lack of appreciation and a lack of understanding for each other and for where we are in our journeys, and that we are all trying to contribute to making this world a better place for animals in our own way, and that none of us can do it alone, and that we need all of those different approaches as well, because every person that we have to influence will be influenced in a different way. So let's be very gentle and generous to each other, and not be distracted by the diversity that we have, but let's try to use that to our advantage.
Wonderful. So, if you had the power to change one thing about the human-non-human animal relationship, what would it be?
I think what I would really like to achieve on the broader scale is to slash that divide between human animals and non-human animals, because it is really a very artificial divide. We are all just animals, in my view, and we are all sharing the same environment. And if we would acknowledge that we have so many more things in common with each other than differences, then we would look at animals very differently, and we would treat them in a very different way, I think. That would really solve most of the problems that we are currently trying to work on and that we are talking about so much. But I think also what we should do is really, how to say that? We have to embrace innovation because there are so many opportunities with new technology that comes about that could further our cause. And I'm not just talking about technical innovation, but I'm also talking about increased knowledge of how humans operate as a species, psychology basically. How can we influence people, and we should always act with respect and understanding for others, because that's the only way that we can connect with people. If we act from anger, if we respond emotionally, then we are putting ourselves on the back foot already in what we want to achieve. We have to be understanding for each other, and like if we do get angry because we are dealing with really highly emotional issues, and a lot of us get distressed when we see someone do something to an animal that we think is really bad. But for our own cause and for the animal's sake, let's try to sit back for a little while when we see that, and reflect on it, and then consider what the most effective response to that would be, instead of having an emotional response that can backfire and that can do our cause more harm than good.
Wonderful. Now, this isn't an official 5 quick questions, but do you agree that Tom Tom's very handsome?
He's certainly very handsome, yes. And also, I'm quite envious of him having such a lovely little nap there.
Yeah, he's sleeping right through the interview.
Yeah.
Okay, now, Jay, what are you working on next?
So, Four Paws, as I mentioned earlier, the fashion campaign that we're running, called Wear It Kind, is a very big focus of us this year. We're really hopeful that we will make big strides in ending the issue of mulesing in Australia, and making much more progress with issues, on ending fur use in fashion, etc. The bushfire response that we talked about. Also for us, we are working in a number of Southeast Asian countries on the dog and cat meat trade campaign. So we really want to make a big dent in that, and again that means changing society on a lot of different levels. And we have a very strong team on the ground there that's working with local partners to achieve that. It's going to be a really big year for us in that respect as well. We will continue all the rescues that we do around the world. We currently have a team in Sudan who's trying to save the lives of a couple of lions and other animals in the zoo who, they have lost 2/3 of their body weight already because they haven't been fed for a very long time. But they're getting really good care now, and we just hope the best. We hope that we can save them.
Wonderful. So how can people find out more, or where can they go to find out more?
Yeah, the best place nowadays to get the most current updates are the social media networks, of course. So if people would search for Four Paws Australia on Facebook, then that would be a very good source for them. If they're very visually orientated, Instagram, of course, is a channel where we share a lot of the sometimes very horrible, although we try to keep it down a little bit, not to shock people, but often also very beautiful images that we share of the transformation of animals that we've rescued and have started a new life in our sanctuaries. So again, search for Four Paws Australia on your Instagram and find us there. And then, of course, there's our website, four-paws.org.au, where all the links to our social media channels are, and where people can also sign up to our e-newsletter. So they can be up to date with our latest news and the work that we are doing.
Wonderful. Well, I wish you all the very best for your campaign work. And thank you so much for coming on the podcast. And thank you to the listeners for joining us for Knowing Animals, a podcast where we talk to animal studies scholars and animal advocates about the work they do for animals. And we're also on social media. We're on Twitter at knowing_animals, and we're also at Facebook at Knowing Animals and Instagram at Knowing Animals. Finally, don't forget to leave a review on iTunes. Reviews make it easier for other people to find the podcast. I'm Siobhan O'Sullivan, and I do like knowing animals. For more great iRaw podcasts, visit irawpod.com. That's IROARPOD.com.